What were the goals of the NEV Road Trip?
So this NEV Road Trip, as it was titled, consisted of 5 vehicles across different OEMs. We had in total 10 participants who joined us on this trip. And I think the objective of the trip was for us to be able to really communicate to consumers out there the realities of owning and doing long distance trips with electric vehicles. The reason being is, I think there's a lot of information and misinformation out in the public domain. There's conversations around, range anxiety related matters, there's around, charging infrastructure and so forth. And I mean, there's a multitude of other conversations out there, but, through an initiative like this, and you can see based on the composition of the drivers who are participating in the trip, we have people from all walks of life. We've had colleagues who are first-time drivers of an electric vehicle who joined us in the trip. There were quite a few of them. We had experienced drivers, myself being included as well, who joined the trip too, because once again, we wanted to make sure that we had people, not necessarily just from the automotive industry being involved, but people from all walks of life, which, if you look at the driving public, it would be exactly the same. And having all of those people come together, experience a common road trip, but then also, through that experience, for us to be able to, gain the type of insights that we actually gained ultimately on this NEV road trip, to then communicate out into the public to really demystify what it's all about.
What are your insights and key takeaways?
I think one of the first insights that we took out of the trip was the fact that even for the drivers who weren't necessarily experienced in driving electric vehicles, after the road trip, everybody was actually positive about the driving experience. It speaks to the fact that the technology itself is far superior to what is available today within ICE vehicles, and it's on many different aspects. It's the power of the vehicles, it's the silence of the vehicles, so the environment that you're within, and there's a multitude of other factors to account for. But even with some of the challenges we ended up experiencing during this road trip, and there were a multitude of them, and I think we'll touch on it a little bit later on, every single driver at the conclusion of the road trip was able to say, even though with all of the challenges experienced, the overarching experience of driving an electric vehicle over 2,225 kilometers was a positive one, and they'd be willing to do it again. So I think that was one of the more important insights that I was able to gather out of this. And maybe some of the other ones would be in regards to planning. I'll just touch on that very briefly. I think from a planning perspective, and any road trip that you do, may that be in a petrol, diesel, or an electric vehicle, planning is usually, key to making sure it's a success. You need to know over how many days you're traveling, or what are the places you're going to stop at, where are you going to get refreshments, where are you going to sleep over. So the planning aspect is quite important. And I think due to the ecosystem itself being relatively new or nascent, what that meant is that there was a certain amount of planning done for us to be able to ensure that we can successfully get to the end, which we did, just by the way. But we made sure there was a fair amount of planning done. But there was also a lot of stuff that we just couldn't account for. And I think that in itself resulted in some very interesting adventures for us, which, once again, leads into the objective of the road trip. So there wasn't really an issue. But I think the learning from there is we also need to take into consideration and also have an appreciation for the fact that this is a new environment, a new ecosystem, a new vehicle, and over time it will get a lot better, and it means less planning be needed. But at this stage, you do have to, properly think about how you execute on this, so that ultimately you're going to have that experience that you are ultimately looking to achieve at the end of the road trip.
What were the biggest challenges you faced on the NEV Road Trip?
So in regards to challenges, I think there's maybe 3 challenges I'll highlight as part of this road trip at least. One, I think it was, and maybe taking a little bit of a light-hearted way about it, the lack of sleep. And I'm touching on it from the perspective of, we were quite ambitious in the way that we planned this road trip. Over 4 days, we were looking to cover 2,225 kilometers. Through the road trip, we also planned multiple events along the way. We had an opportunity to take the cars onto a racetrack, for example. We went up the Swartberg Pass, which was also one of the highlights of the trip. And I think, in the upfront planning, we were a little bit ambitious. And that meant that the amount of time that we had available to us to get to the conclusion of the road trip, which was on top of Signal Hill, it did end up taking a lot more time than we initially anticipated. That resulted in me having to drive a lot of the participants in not sleeping as much, which I think people did complain about. So that was definitely one of those elements where there was a challenge. And looking at it in hindsight, I think we should have made this a 5-day road trip versus a 4-day one. But I think looking more towards the electric mobility conversation, I think some of the charging infrastructure related ones would be another one of the challenge, and let me unpack that just a little bit. During the road trip, there were instances in which we weren't able to charge the cars at the fast chargers that we arrived at and we were looking to the charging on. Now, the issue with this is when you get to those locations and you cannot charge, unless you've got the range available in your car to be able to get to the next charger, you could potentially become stuck. So that is indeed one of those challenges that you would have to surmount in order for you to be able to make it to your destination ultimately. And I think, there were certain instances in which, through the help of the infrastructure providers, we were able to resolve it. Again, they're really brilliant, and we've got to give them credit for that. You give them a phone call, you send a WhatsApp, because there's multiple ways of getting a hold of them. They really help to navigate you through a lot of the challenges you would end up facing. And I think that does reassure the drivers who are driving within electric vehicles that even if you do face challenges, a lot of the times you will be able to surmount it with the help of the people there who are actually looking to support you on such journeys, which is great. But there were challenges also we experienced along the way with charging infrastructure where even though they did come to the table and they were trying to help us out, there were some unexpected matters which unfolded, which meant that we wouldn't be able to charge in a timely manner. I think one of those was instances in which the charging infrastructure didn't have a signal, so basically a mobile signal, same as your cell phone wouldn't. So without having a signal, it wasn't able to communicate back to the head office in order to be able to exchange the information that was needed, and that resulted in the inability for us to be able to immediately charge. There was ways of working around it. It took us a little bit of time for us to be able to get to that conclusion, but these type of issues that we see within the charging infrastructure, due to the fact that the ecosystem is nascent, we would expect that kind of stuff to happen. But as mass adoption starts, driving forward, and we see the common man, on the street starting to get into electric vehicles who want to do such road trips, these are the things that we do have to overcome so that you're not going to end up getting to a situation where you have multiple drivers stuck at a charger because you couldn't, get the batteries up. So I think that's another interesting challenge which we encountered a couple of times along the trip, and I think there's a lot of room for improvement from that perspective. And perhaps the third challenge that I would highlight is in regards to how different people managed the state of charge, as they call it, on the cars. So while petrol and diesel vehicles would have a tank full of petrol and diesel, and you would look at your fuel gauge to see how much fuel you got left in order for you to gauge if you need to go to a petrol station, the similar thing applies to electric vehicles. Looking at the amount of electricity that you're using, you need to gauge, okay, do I need to get to a certain stop to charge or not? And the third challenge that I was alluding to is the fact that different people have different styles of driving. And depending on if you're inexperienced or experienced EV driver, the way that you manage that range is quite different. So I think we had a certain instance with a car in which some of the drivers, if I can put it this way, was relatively lead-footed. So they weren't necessarily getting the type of range that they were expecting to get out of the car. Versus other vehicles, and mine included as well, I was able to manage it quite comfortably in order for me to be able to get to my next destinations. So I think that contributes towards range anxiety and sometimes also into delays in the vehicle, because one of the interesting things about EVs is that the slower you drive it, the more efficient it is. So if you're doing 120 kilometers on a highway to get from A to B versus if you're doing it at 80 kilometers, you'll be able to both get to the destination, but your state of charge on the car will be quite different. So the way that you manage the range on a vehicle is by managing the speed that you travel at, because it uses more energy. And I think from a challenge perspective, as I highlighted, it's really around understanding how new energy vehicles, electric vehicles work versus your traditional ICE vehicles, which runs on petrol and diesel.
What is range anxiety?
Range anxiety is basically when you are in a vehicle and you're looking at where you are destined to go to. So there'll be a certain amount of kilometers that you're looking to, drive in order to get to a certain destination. And when you look at the state of charge on your vehicle, you realize that you might potentially not have enough range in your batteries, or you don't have enough electricity in your batteries for you to be able to get to a certain destination. So it's the same thing as petrol diesel vehicles. If you don't have enough fuel inside of your fuel tank and you're trying to drive 100 kilometers, yet your fuel's going to only get you 60 kilometers, then you're going to start feeling anxiety around, am I going to end up stopping in the middle of the road? And on the electric vehicle side, it's exactly the same thing. So people refer to it as a range anxiety. But I think the big difference here is if you're in a petrol or diesel vehicle, there's really no way for you to be able to increase the amount of petrol or diesel in your vehicle to be able to bridge that gap, minus going there and actually filling your tank up. I think the good thing about electric vehicles is if you slow down, you'll consume less energy, meaning you'll be able to stretch the amount of distance that you can travel in an electric vehicle. But also at the same time, electric vehicles have regenerative braking. Meaning if you're lucky and you're going from a higher elevation to a lower elevation, you could actually use the regenerative braking to be able to charge your vehicle as you're going down that hill and covering the distance. So even though you might feel range anxiety due to some uncertainties that you might be encountering, the flip side is that electric vehicles, due to the technology, has ways of you being able to manage that so that even if you do feel anxiety, you are able to ultimately get your destination by being clever about how you're driving those vehicles.
What is the difference between an AC charger and a DC charger?
Okay, so you can take an AC charger as being a slower charger, and the reason for it is AC chargers are typically able to deliver a maximum of 22 kilowatts of power, although this is subject to the availability of the required technology inside of the vehicles. And what that means is most vehicles on the road today are typically rated for only the 11 kilowatt AC charging. So it's the slower side of the charging. And then the DC charger is where, and it's direct current, it's the much faster charger. So on the South African networks today, we get chargers that are rated up to about, give or take, 150 kilowatts. So as long as the vehicle itself is able to support that capacity, you'll be able to charge up to 150 kilowatts an hour in order to get the electrons into your battery. Now, about compatibility. One of the issues that we faced on this road trip was where a vehicle, relatively new one on the market, being the BYD Seal, got to a charger, plugged in, and the charging session didn't start. And again, we don't necessarily want to go into the details around why that was the case, but I think at this stage, our conclusion that we reached was that due to the vehicle being very new and also the charging infrastructure that's being used was relatively old, the two weren't communicating correctly. And the way that chargers work is you don't just plug it in and electricity immediately delivers. You do the plug-in, and then as you plug it in, the charger and the vehicle itself will ask each other to say, can we use this much electricity in order to make it flow from one side to another? And it would do that in stages. And what happened in the instance of this vehicle, the BYD, was that we call it the handshake, didn't happen correctly. So when the DC charging cable was plugged into the vehicle, it wasn't able to establish that handshake correctly, and then it failed. And the moment it fails, it basically means that it will not deliver electricity. And there was an instance in which a vehicle had to be there for a very long amount of time while we were trying to work around that issue in order to be able to get that vehicle to the next destination.
Have you seen any shifts in consumer preferences regarding EVs?
So I think the South African market itself, not too much. The reason being is it's still a nascent market. even though the amount of vehicles that are available now for sale has exponentially increased over the last 2 years, the amount of vehicles still in comparison to your ICE vehicles is limited. So, from a vehicle trends perspective, I think the biggest point I can highlight from a South African market side is that the availability of more reasonably priced vehicles have become prevalent. And what that has resulted in is more people buying those vehicles within the 500 to about the 700,000 Rand range. So we are starting to see an uptick in the amount of electric vehicles we're seeing within the market around those type of vehicles. And it's purely because of the affordability factor when it comes to EVs. So I think that's one trend you could pick up on, although I think over the next couple of years, we'll see how that unfolds too, because when it comes to electric vehicles, I think we'll end up seeing a sweet spot around the type of vehicles which will get adopted, including from a brand perspective and so forth as well. But again, I think from a South African market side, we're still trying to see where the market is going to head to overall. I think from an overseas market perspective, the interesting trend has really been around the success of the Chinese players. And it really boils down to 2 points as far as I'm concerned. Number one is the price of the vehicles, because overall, ICE vehicles compared to EVs are still priced at a lower price point, which means that there's an expectation from the consumers around, so why am I paying for an electric vehicle that is anything from 15 to 30% more expensive compared to its ICE equivalent? So I think the offering that the Chinese are bringing in is very competitive from a pricing perspective, which is attractive for consumers, but also from the availability of functionality within these vehicles. When you look at some of these vehicles, they are priced at a much lower price point compared to their peers. And some of the technologies and functionalities in these vehicles is typically what you would expect within high-end vehicles as well. So I think the disruption of the Chinese OEMs coming into the market with a product which is very, very attractively priced, but comes with a whole lot of functionality which otherwise you wouldn't expect in some of the legacy vehicles, does make a big difference in regards to the consumer perception around some of the products. And when they're starting to look at what electric vehicles they want to adopt and they actually start driving some of these vehicles, it's resulting in a lot of adoption within the Chinese vehicle segment. Hence, the landscape itself has been disrupted and a lot of challenges are being faced by the legacy players right now.
How do ICE vehicles compare to EVs in terms of cost?
So I've personally done an analysis around this, give or take about a year and a half ago, maybe close on to 2 years ago actually, looking at the total cost of ownership of a ICE vehicle versus a electric vehicle. One of the purposes of doing this exercise was I wanted to personally understand, is indeed an electric vehicle, from a total cost of ownership perspective, more attractive than an ICE vehicle? That was one of the reasons. But also at the same time, I wanted to test out for myself and, as part of myself buying an electric vehicle, understand what are the dynamics associated with that. And again, without getting into too much of the details, the conclusion that I reached was, from a total cost of ownership perspective over a 5-year period, at least at this stage, electric vehicles are more expensive. Depending on if you're buying a cash transaction, meaning you buy the vehicles for completely cash, or if you go for a financed option, the total cost of ownership gap is different. I think the cash transaction is a lot closer versus if you're looking at it from a finance perspective, it could be anything from 15 to about 25% more expensive over a 5-year period. And this is not because of the running cost of the vehicle, because the running costs of EVs is significantly cheaper. This is without a doubt. But when you look at the upfront cost of the electric vehicle, which is the challenge that we're facing here, because of that 20 to 40% gap between the two sides, what that ends up doing from a total cost of ownership perspective, including the residual value of the vehicle, which is how much would you be able to sell the vehicle in 5 years' time, when you add those two data points into the calculation around your total cost of ownership, unfortunately at this stage electric vehicles are indeed higher. But just to add a caveat there, we are expecting electric vehicle prices to continue to go down. I just saw an article this morning in which they're saying by 2026 we might see battery prices halved from the current prices over the next 2 years now, give or take. So if those type of things start happening, that upfront cost of an electric vehicle most likely hit parity to ICE vehicles. Then it'll really be about the operational costs. And in those instances, EVs are by far more efficient and more cost effective, which means the total cost of ownership conversation over the next couple of years most likely will end up shifting.
What can government do to encourage adoption of EVs?
So I think from my side it would be two things. And one is to do with instilling confidence in the market. And let me just elaborate on that a little bit more. I think the market itself, meaning the South African market, unless you're an early adopter, a lot of people are on the fence in regards to going for electric vehicles. And that is due to the fact that when it comes to electric vehicles, it's still a relatively new technology. People don't know the direction it's taking and so forth. And the adoption rate at this stage isn't very high. I think over the last year and a half or so, there's been a lot more electric vehicles that you see on the road. But until you start to seeing that critical mass being hit, it's going to take time for the people to start being confident around it. So one of the things that government could end up doing is to instill confidence in the market is for government themselves to start putting policies in place for government to adopt electric vehicles. We know from a fleet perspective, there's the national government and even the provincial governments run hundreds and thousands of vehicles of their own. And if they could start looking at converting each of those vehicles into an electric vehicle, I think that in itself will start increasing the amount of vehicles that you start to see on the roads. And it will also show from a government perspective that government is committed to making sure that we are heading towards a more sustainable form of transport. And I think that type of shift in policy could really help galvanize both the commercial industries, because that would create the demand that the industry is looking for to make further investments, but also in parallel from a consumer's perspective, because then the consumers would see more vehicles on the road, and that in itself would have a knock-on effect to helping to instill that further confidence needed, which then can ultimately lead into more adoption, hopefully over time. So I think that's one of the more important parts from a policy perspective. Second one, and we've spoken about it in multiple forums, including myself. I alluded to it earlier on as part of the total cost of ownership conversation, is really the cost. The vehicles themselves are priced very high. And government need to really think hard about this, because it's about the sustainability of our local automotive industry, because we know that our global peers are heading in that direction. We are primarily an export-orientated industry when it comes to automotive, even though we do have a fair amount of demand on the ground here. But we need to make sure that from a business case perspective, that is sustainable. So we do need to try and shift the price of vehicles on the ground here to help us drive that local adoption, which is the one angle. And I think there's also another point to be made around ad valorem, which many media houses have highlighted too. Even if you look at some of the vehicles, which typically you would consider to be in the medium segment or even the lower segments, due to the ad valorem taxes, they ended up being priced in a category which is really unaffordable for everyday South Africans. And, electric vehicles shouldn't be just for the realm of the rich. Electric vehicles themselves have significant benefits for everybody. For the everyday man on the road, it's really about the day-to-day expense of the vehicle. How many people spend 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 rand per month on petrol, and that is coming directly out of the pocket of the consumers? And I can attest this myself, being an electric vehicle driver. I spend approximately 400 rand a month on electricity. And when I was driving a petrol vehicle, which is before this vehicle that I've had, I was spending close to 4,500 to 5,000 rand per month on petrol. So when you do that math, that extra 4,000 rand that I'm spending is in my pocket to spend on other things. For example, spending it on my children, spending it on groceries and so forth. So I think that being able to help the consumers by adopting electric mobility, and that the benefits that occurs from it is accrued to the consumers, I think that's really an important consideration, and it's something I'm hoping that the government can come to the table to realize as well.
What lessons can SA learn from other countries to increase EV adoption?
I think some of the lessons that they can take away from other markets, the important ones would be, one, from the Chinese. I think there's a lesson to be learned there. The Chinese government, perhaps due to the way that the government itself is structured, have taken a single unified approach to say this is the direction that they are going to take in order to realize electric mobility within the country. And the lesson from there is that if there's a message from the top that is communicated downwards, and that's clear and concise, and also the policies that are introduced speak to that exact message, I think South Africa could most likely take a similar direction to China, where we would be able to leapfrog and really start to, reindustrialize off the back of the opportunity that this is presenting us. So I think, from that perspective, that's something that we should take a page out of the Chinese's book in regards to how we, as South Africa, can really get this mobility ecosystem going from an electrification perspective. I think there's also lessons to be learned from some of the other markets, especially the forerunners, like the European market, for example. Many of the European markets have got, thousands of charging infrastructure that's been rolled out throughout the countries now. But because they were running ahead, there's a lot of challenges that they've faced in relation to infrastructure that we could most likely learn from, and instead of going through the same type of challenges, we could, through those lessons, implement and introduce mechanisms so that we're not going to end up with the same type of issues. So I think from a charging infrastructure perspective, and also any other corresponding enabling infrastructure that it would be beneficial for the mobility ecosystem, we could look at those and say, so where have the Europeans tripped up on, as an example, and you really take those lessons to heart and say, how can we work with the private sector, the CPO or the charging infrastructure providers, to ensure that we do not end up in the same boat? And then maybe a third lesson that I would like to also take out is in regards to helping consumer perceptions around electric vehicles. One of the challenges in North America right now is, you got certain states in which the information around electric vehicles is not necessarily conducive to helping to drive adoption. And you can see that by speaking to the everyday man on the road, because they would say, we would not buy an electric vehicle because of whatever reason. But the problem with that is it's usually not grounded in facts. And it's always based upon certain perceptions within the market, which really doesn't speak to some of the benefits that you would gain out of adopting electric vehicles. So I think from that perspective, also taking to heart that ultimately it's people that are buying these vehicles. So we need to be able to speak to the people's hearts as to why this is something they should be considering, because ultimately, if we don't have the people on our side, and the people themselves are convinced about the fact that electric vehicles is beneficial for them as an individual, we'll never be able to succeed in the adoption of electric vehicles. So I think those would be some of the takeaways that I like to highlight to the people out there.